Hello everyone, we will start at just a few minutes. Before we start, if you have questions, there is an option to ask questions on the top right of the page, and I look forward to answering them. So yes, just we will begin in a few moments to start to talk about the living in China. I hope you can all hear me, and if you can, please send a message across, send me a question, or just say hi. You can hear me. Thank you very much. So it is now 12 o'clock. I'm going to start. I see we have a few people here. And I would like to say to those that who are here, welcome. Thank you for coming. Joining. My name is George. I work with the Coventry University Confucius Institute, and this is our first ever Chinese Corner. So I hope you enjoy. So I would like to begin by giving a brief introduction about Coventry University Confucius Institute, who we are and what we do. So the mission of the Confucius Institute is to share Chinese language and culture, and for us in Coventry University Confucius Institute, that means we are focused on the West Midlands. Now, that means we cover not only Coventry, but most of Warwickshire, Leamington, down to Stratford and Birmingham. And one of the main things that we do is to run Chinese language classes, which are available not only for staff and students in the university, but also for people in the wider community. We run cultural training sessions across the university for people who are interested in learning more about China, what are the needs and requirements of Chinese students, and also what are the employability areas for Chinese students. We also organize and fund trips to China. We run in normal years, we would send a group of British or Coventry University students to China, to our partner university over there. And we also try to support local businesses in providing and building links to China. So if you have, again, any questions about any of these things, please let me know and we can contact. So let us start by having a brief overview of what this Chinese Corner event actually is. So what is a Chinese Corner? My view on a Chinese Corner is that we are trying to run a quite informal session we would like this to be, or I would like this to be, as interactive as this particular technology allows, so that we can look at different aspects of Chinese culture or cultural activities relating to China and discuss them with people who are interested. And of course, this clearly fits with the mission and the goals of the Confucius Institute, because we are always interested in sharing any knowledge, any experience that we have that people within the local community may find interesting. How can you be involved in the Chinese Corner? In the Teams live session like we run today, I welcome questions, comments. I will see all of them and publish and respond to any appropriate questions that you have. And if you would like to suggest any topics, or if you have any further questions about what we do or how we could involve with you, I've provided our email address here, confuciusinstitute@coventry.ac.uk. You are welcome to send us messages, requests, or if you would like any further information about our Chinese classes, or you would like us to come to provide some sort of cultural activity, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We are always looking for ways to try to support people. So today's session, what are we going to do? This is myself in China. The goal of this session is to share my personal experiences living and working in China. This is something that my team has asked me to lead on, and excuse me, it is something that I'm very happy to share with. Excuse me. So the idea of sharing a decade's worth of experience of living and working in China is that this could cover a huge amount of topics, and any of them I would be able to talk about for at least an hour. So if you have questions, or if there are some aspects of life and work in China that you are particularly interested, I welcome questions. As I've mentioned, this session, I would like it to be as interactive as possible. If you have some area of interest you would like to learn more about, please ask, and I am very happy to get sidetracked from what I have prepared if you find that something would be more interesting for you. I'm more than happy to be sidetracked, and I welcome it. So here we go. The first question we've got here. So Lauren, when HSK exams will next be available? Understandably, we're not sure. I think we are going to send out as soon as we are very clear about the next availability of HSK exams. We will publish that information. Unfortunately, at the moment there is not confirmation about when that will be, so I'm not comfortable giving out any dates that might then have to be cancelled further on. So why China? I think this is how I've started, and I think how my first place is to give a little bit of background about why I went to China, what did I do, and why it's different. So in about 2000, and it must have been 2006, I started to work at a private school in a city called Taiyuan in Shanxi province in northern China. So I will talk a little bit about private schools in a moment, but I spent a year there. Then I went to started teaching in universities in that city, and I spent about the next 6 years teaching English across various universities in Taiyuan. My main university was one that had the very interesting name of Taiyuan Normal University. There are many normal universities in China. I've never quite understood what exactly that means and what would be an abnormal university. However, it was a good place to work. Working at the universities, I was very fortunate. There was a lot of always extra work available and some travel opportunities, particularly with IELTS, which is the International English Language Testing System. This is the English test that any Chinese student would take if they wish to come to study in a British university. Excuse me. And also, since Taiyuan was quite a city, then we were able to get, myself and some of my colleagues were invited to take part in some acting and sort of entertainment jobs. We found ourselves singing in music videos and took part in several different types of television, mostly because the companies, the television groups wanted to have some foreign face rather than acting ability. Watching back one of my roles, it's very clear that the acting ability is not really there. Certainly not to be speaking on a national television show. I moved on to spend a year in Ningbo, near to the Nottingham University Ningbo campus, and I spent 3 years after that in Chongqing, setting up a joint degree program at the Southwest University of Political Science and Law. So this is quite a excuse me. So excuse me. Before this, and then after that, about 3 years in Chongqing, I moved back to the UK to continue to work at Coventry University. Now, did I take I'm being asked, did I take advertising work? I did. I took part in one TV commercial. I did. It was for a walnut company. I have never seen the advert, but it was. I spent a day dressed in a suit, wandering around a factory, and had to try to look intelligent, look like I was someone from an international business, and shook hands with the CEOs and the management of the company. And it was an interesting day. Everything was slow and unusual. Obviously, for someone who's not done that before, that was the sort of experience that it would be very difficult to have in the UK. So thank you, James. Thank you for that question. So, excuse me. Let's move on to what I was going to be looking at in the next one. So, a couple of pictures here. When I said I moved to Taiyuan in Shanxi province, Taiyuan is located here in the red spot. I should mention that this is certainly, if you are interested in recording, this session is being recorded, and I will make the recording available in various places. Of course, as this will not include any of your personal details. So Taiyuan in Shanxi province. Shanxi province is the yellow area, and the city is based in this small red dot in northern China. Taiyuan is a city that is most known for its coal, and it is it's a maybe what they call maybe a third tier city. It's most popular or most known for its coal. So the first thing that I've prepared to talk about was the private schools in China and their requirements and their constant need for workers, particularly international teachers. So for many people like myself back then, the first job that people would have going to China, or the most common opportunity to spend time living and working in China, would be working at private English schools. And there are many very large companies that run private English schools. I worked for one called English First, which is a worldwide company. I was recruited in the UK, and they sent me to, well, they obviously put my name onto an internal database of potential teachers, and the local school in Taiyuan called me and asked me to go to work there. Now, when you go to work for one of these companies, and I believe it is still the same today, the contracts that are encouraged and the contracts that are available are annual contracts. You would have 1 year, and the school would provide you with reimbursed flights, and they would reimburse you for your flights at the end of the contract. They provide accommodation, which is usually shared with other teachers, and you get quite a comfortable salary. Of course, living in a place like Taiyuan, which is a smaller city, it's very cheap to live there, and if your accommodation is already paid for, then you can have quite a comfortable lifestyle. So because of this sort of annual salary, there is high turnover, and this generally is due to this job attracting quite young people, usually early 20s, who've recently graduated, who are looking for sort of a year of adventure, a year of something different or unusual. For many people, this turns into a career that is focused on China, and for others, it's simply a time to go home. Now, with the private schools, these are usually running in the evening and the weekend. So during the daytime, there's a lot of free time for the teachers, and as there are usually a lot of young people living together, there is often quite a party atmosphere that I found, and I've seen from many of my people I've known through different cities. Now, I chose to leave this after about a year to go to work in a university, and I think that was the best choice for myself. But there's a big difference between working in the private school and the universities in China. Fundamentally, for me, the difference between the private school in China and the university in China is that the hours were better, and we had much more holiday. Now, this was because when you are the private, when you are what they call a foreign teacher in a Chinese university, your role is that of filling a quota. Most universities are required to have foreign teachers, and as such, there is little pressure for you from the academic side of things. And certainly compared to the pressures and requirements of the Chinese academics or being an academic in the UK, it's a lot less pressure. As long as we turn up and run classes, then the universities tend to be satisfied. So due to that, it was up to the individual to ensure that we were providing a high quality learning experience. In the same way with the private schools, I should clarify this point, that obviously when there are different universities will have some different approaches to foreign teachers, and this is often based on where they are and how easy they are to find foreign teachers. In a smaller city like Taiyuan, it is harder to find foreign teachers, and the purpose of the classes was not to prepare students to get to international universities or to progress to other universities. It was simply to fulfill a language requirement module in their course. On some of the larger universities, then of course there is more responsibility on the international and the foreign teachers. The contracts here are very much the same. You have a single year, you get your accommodation and flights reimbursed. Generally speaking, there's a lower salary than in private schools, but as I've mentioned, the class load is a lot smaller, and we have a lot of opportunity for extra work, especially IELTS. Now, IELTS is a huge industry in China. IELTS, as I've mentioned, is the International English Language Testing System, and this is what students will prepare for to come to study in the UK. This is similar to the question I had earlier about the HSK, the Hanyu Shuiping Kaoshi. This is the Chinese language test. For IELTS, this is the English language test, and for students in universities around the country, that is the main goal, to get this high score in IELTS, without which you cannot get across to the UK. The next interesting question here, thank you, is was that being asked again. I had a question earlier about IELTS, the 6.5 level. Now, thank you, James, for many questions. I appreciate it. The IELTS of 6.5 requirement, I want to clarify that the 6.5, it's difficult to say if the 6.5 requirement is enough, and in and of itself, I would probably suggest that an IELTS score is not a true indicator of how well a student, a non-native speaker, would be able to engage and complete classes within the UK, especially when a test is something that can be prepared for and planned for to reach that minimum requirement. So it's worthwhile understanding, and this again, this is a sidetrack that I'm happy to take with IELTS. Students in China are prepared from the young age to pass exams. From a young age, their purpose is to prepare specifically for exams. This is what's the Gaokao, the Chinese entrance test, is generally speaking the first one, and the IELTS is treated pretty much in the same way. So when students then decide to prepare for the IELTS test, this cultural approach to education comes in, and students prepare specifically to get the minimum requirement, or the requirement they need to come to the UK. That means that the 6.5 that is seen and provided by many universities as the minimum level to enter onto the course is not necessarily high enough. However, this is not necessarily due to IELTS. This is due to the wider context of their language learning, if that makes sense. So I think the issue of preparing students to come to the universities in the UK is a large issue, and it's worth remembering that the IELTS score is specifically a government requirement. It is something from the UK visas section. They require students to have a certificate to show the language ability. From the university side, I think it would be worth being in some way more flexible. Ideally, there would be an English for academic purposes test that would be more practical or focused on their targeted course, whether that's writing an essay, showing some research, or participating in an online seminar. However, that would be very difficult to administer in large numbers, or certainly at scale. So I think we're starting to have a I do enjoy this conversation with James. We've had a new question. This basically
sorry, George, to make so many questions. I'm conscious there are not many people in the room, so if you don't mind me just butting in,
that's okay.
I'm mixing up a lot of subjects there. I just would like to pick up on what you just said, and because of the way the chat is, I've just made the question without really formulating it. English for academic purposes. Is IELTS English for academic purposes or not?
It is not. IELTS is not English for academic purposes. It is a specific language test to show at that moment what have they done. So English for academic purposes for myself would be more looking at the pre-sessional English, looking at a larger course, having more practical things. It's not ideal, IELTS. However, it is the requirement that can be scaled and that can be indicative of a level. So, and like any test, it can be prepared for, you can game the test a little bit to get that higher score.
Okay, so
I think it's a big discussion to have about this one from the university, from the recruitment and and entering the university. That's something quite specific that I think is a wider test, and perhaps getting a little bit far from the Chinese culture. That I think, James, perhaps we can follow up the discussion later on.
Okay, sorry, usually I have specific concerns, but just to finish on that, is there anybody who prepares Chinese students for English for academic purposes? Are you saying there really isn't such a thing?
Oh, there is. It depends on the course and the specific goal. We run, I think the key there, we're looking at pre-sessional English courses. There are a lot of the private schools will have preparation. However, the focus through the culture of learning across China is really focused on exam scores, whereas English for academic purposes is more about, it's less quantifiable in some way, because it's more about preparing skills for a foundation of skills, a foundation of language ability, a foundation of confidence to ask questions, and changing the way people think or approach subjects. That's perhaps not seen by a lot of stakeholders, parents and other people, as so important. So for myself, and when I talk to staff at Chinese universities, I try to push this idea to prepare students who will progress to our university. However, it's often becomes seen as secondary to getting that specific IELTS score, which can take the whole focus of maybe a year or two of study at the university. It's a wide issue that I think is.
Thanks, George.
Okay, no, thanks. I appreciate the question, James. So I'm going to move across. Mariana, thank you very much for your question. So here, my professional journey, share a bit of my personal journey, how it felt to adapt to the local culture. Absolutely, and I'm very happy to do so. As I've said, let me see now. Some of my personal journey and my adapting to the local culture, I think some of the things that are looking at are some of the key things that I saw and I found that were very different. I've made a little note of these already. I think one of the key difference and the getting used to things would be about the different approach to the way people live their lives inside and outside. So the street life in China is very, very different to the UK. My first experience of arriving in China with the private school was a massive, I suppose, eye-opening experience in that I arrived quite late at night. The roommates that I would be living with were similar age to me, also early 20s. And when I arrived, they said, "Well done, you're here. Drop your suitcase, and we're going out." And we went out and when we were walking around the city, we ended up walking around some of these quite small, narrow alleyways, which you would imagine in the West, in a strange city, I would not walk down. You wouldn't think of walking down little alleyways like this. However, as we walked through them, there were little kids running around. There were barbecue stalls set up, and we found generally that across all of these places, it was just open and people were living their lives outside, and that was particularly interesting and something to adapt, change the ideas. The other things we noticed, I think that we worth looking in is, took me a while to realize that the schedule is very different in China to UK, in that, as I've put here, late night for school kids. This is pretty much helping me to remember, in that the kids who go to school, they go home late at night. When you're walking around at 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening, you would see teenagers in school uniform riding around on their bicycles. But we would find out later on that these students are coming home from school, and they would end up doing more homework, which perhaps is something that took a while to get used to. The next one I've said here is park life, and I think I've got this small picture here. A lot of living in China is communal, and indeed the way that Chinese people are taught from a young age is based around excuse me, would be based around people doing things together. So in the parks and on the streets and in the living communities, we see as you see in this picture, there are a lot of exercise equipment that is widely used. Perhaps maybe not so much now during the pandemic, but all of this is used on early in the morning after schools by people who are just using that equipment, people who are playing chess, Chinese chess, people playing games, people spending time with their families, all outside. And that's something that's a little unusual. So if you go to, when I would suggest to people who go to China, one of the key experiences to try to learn and see what the Chinese people do is to wake up early and go to the local parks at around 7 o'clock in the morning, and you will see the parks are full of people doing their daily exercise. And the big thing is that there is no sense of embarrassment or shame, perhaps, of doing the things outside, which we might feel in the UK. There are people who stand at the side of the lake and shout. They simply practice shouting aloud, walking backwards and slapping. People would practice their music instruments. I'd often see people playing saxophone, there was particularly a couple of people practicing musical instruments in the middle of the park. And it was one of the key things we've seen as well with the local culture is that large groups of generally middle-aged or older ladies standing and dancing together just in the plazas and in the streets. So to see all of this very different approach to life was fascinating. To see that this is everyone just goes out and does everything in the open. And it's something I would heartily suggest to anyone who goes to China, is to spend time in the parks. And for me, you know, being a reserved English person, it was showing things in a way that we would not I would not be comfortable doing. I think that's something that would be useful. So, and how I adapted, I think the main thing to adapt for my adaptation to the local culture was really learning to try to understand. For me, one of the key things that I've understood with culture is that sometimes it would be frustrating. Sometimes the way people do things, I would find would really annoy me, and I would find myself trying to understand why the things are the way they are, especially communally. If you have, for example, children with small children, there's a much different approach to other people's children. It's very common for people to walk up and say hi, and older ladies would touch touch the children, or take pictures without asking. Many things like this, which would emotionally be would have quite an effect. But I wouldn't necessarily accept it, but it's worth trying to understand why things are happening, so that on an intellectual level we say, this is why this comes from a certain place, a positive place, despite it maybe creates a reaction in myself, an emotional reaction based on my cultural difference. So trying to understand that sort of emotional response, and trying to temper that, as it were, with an intellectual understanding of where that response comes from, why things are happening. That was perhaps one of the difficulties, especially the more I would live with the Chinese family, understanding that things that I would see perhaps as rude come from a normal way of doing things, such as constantly being told that you're not wearing enough clothes because it's cold. That was something that started to frustrate me. To be told that I'm cold and I need to put on clothes was something that was very annoying. However, that's how someone shows that they care for you. And I found that, again, an example of the emotional response and the intellectual understanding of where that comes from. So I like that question. I think that's quite useful. Sandra has asked me to say, how easy is it to move around China and integrate without speaking their language fluently? Generally speaking, it's not that difficult, depending on where you are. I don't have a good slide for this, so I'm just going to come off there. Now, moving around China, if you are working in something in a private school, there are people there who will help you all of the time, as long as you have your mobile phone. As long as you have a local mobile phone and you have WeChat, you will be able to get around. There are in most of the train stations, airports, etc., there are English language signs. There are dual language signs, so I found that quite easy, because there is such an industry for language learning. It's usually not too difficult to find someone who can speak a little English, especially around the major cities. So how easy is it? Once you get away from the bigger cities, it becomes more difficult, and then there's a lot more sort of pushing and finding translations on the phone. I say pushing, I say pointing to things. So it's very important to make sure that when you get to a new city, make sure you have the address for your hotel put onto a piece of paper to show to a taxi driver. And I think that would be the key thing. So generally speaking, it's very easy, it's very safe, but it was a lot easier when if you have a phone and someone who's on the end of the phone that you could call up and pass the phone across in when that is necessary. So thank you for that question, Sandra. So one of the things that I think perhaps is a little more personal that I thought would be that I generally find people can find quite interesting is the idea of the Chinese weddings, because this is something that obviously I experienced in China. I got married while I was in China, and I think the weddings are, from a cultural point of view, they're massively important around the world, and the way and the approaches to weddings can be the approaches to weddings can really highlight many aspects of a culture and what's important to them. I've just been asked, how is my Mandarin? I think my response to that is usually my Mandarin should be better. It should be better than it is. I know enough. I can go into a restaurant and I can find out what's the best food, and I can order. I can get into a taxi and have the basic taxi conversation, and the day-to-day life is no problem. However, once it gets beyond into some actual real focused conversation, I tend to struggle with vocabulary particularly. Also, my reading and writing is not as good as it could be. It's a very difficult thing to learn, Chinese reading and writing. So thank you for that question. 应该好多了，但是我现在有学习. I'm studying Chinese still, and I still hope to improve. So Chinese weddings particularly, I think, were an area that can be of great interest to many people. So traditional Western weddings are very, very different from Chinese weddings. So generally speaking, in China, the wedding license, the official aspect of the wedding, is done on a different day to the wedding ceremony. For myself, we were officially and legally married months before we had our our wedding ceremony. I think we had our wedding certificate in September, and we had our first ceremony in January. Now in China, it's very common that people would do professional photo shoots, so they would dress up in many different outfits and have their wedding photographs taken long before the wedding, so that at the wedding ceremony you would see many large photographs of the couple in wedding gowns, in traditional clothes. And again, that's another massive industry. Some people will travel across the country to beautiful locations in order to have the best possible wedding photographs. Some people will pay thousands of pounds to do this. So when you get to this ceremony itself, traditionally in China there are 2 days for a wedding celebration, and that's basically, there would be the first day would be aimed around the groom's family, and the next day would be based around the bride's family. So as you can see, it's a very, very large event to have this wedding. And one of the big differences that we would see China and UK, that also comes down to the reaction we would have based on our taboos and our culture, would be the main gift, and the only real gift that's being given is would be excuse me, the only real thing being given is money, and that money is recorded in a book, specifically how much did each person give. So we have a book somewhere that tells us how much each guest to the wedding gave us. Now, compared to the UK ceremony that we had later on, where we also were given money, but that would be sort of given, we got an envelope with a card in, and we wouldn't put that to a side. We wouldn't record it. It wouldn't be out, you know, in the open, as that were. So that's quite a big difference that we find. So also the weddings start very, very early. The bride will usually be up at sort of 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning to start the hair and makeup, and the groom would take his friends across to the bride's family home at about about 8 o'clock in the morning, 7-8 o'clock in the morning, and then would have some small games, traditions. There your friends, the groom's friends, would bribe their way in, trying to give little gifts, and the bride's friends would try to stop them. And there's quite a lot of fun and small traditions there. Now this ends up with, traditionally speaking, the groom would then literally carry the bride away, and I had to carry my wife for probably a good 100 meters from her house to the car, down 4 flights of stairs, waiting for some fireworks to go off, and then walk about 100 meters to the car that couldn't get to her house. And fortunately, she's not particularly heavy, so that was an interesting tradition. And then there were large lunchtime, very, very ornate, very, very large ceremonies at lunchtime. And one of the interesting things there, I think, is that these ceremonies are in many ways focused on the parents of the bride and groom as much as the bride and groom themselves, in that the parents would pay for this. Many of the guests were friends, colleagues, and part of the relationships and part of the network of the parents. So that would be their social group would all come to support their children getting married. So there were many, many people at my wedding in China, and most of them I have no idea who they were, because they were my mother-in-law's old workmates, her old schoolmates, and it was very, very indicative of the importance of the communal living. And one of the excuse me, one of the major differences, and one of the very interesting things I found, is that the bride and groom must go round to every table to toast with what's called baijiu, which is a spirit which looks enough like water that the bride or groom are able to fill a small cup with water to pretend they're drinking. However, most of the tables will make sure that the groom is drinking alcohol, which can very quickly end up with the groom having difficulty standing. So my next question there, I think I'm going to, I'll take this next question from Yiming that talks about, excuse me, that I'm looking at, if I could bring 3 objects or customs from the UK to China, what would they be? And what are 3 things you'd like to bring from China to the UK? I think that's a fascinating question. It's a very difficult question. 3 things from the UK to China. What are they? It's very difficult to say. Let me see. 3 things bring from the China to the UK are potentially the food. The food in China is some of that is accented. It's very different from the traditional English style Chinese food. Particularly, I would choose to take hot pot, huoguo. That was one of my favorite dishes in China, and we start to see some of them in the UK. However, hot pot Oh, someone's just asked me my favorite food sweet in China as well. I'll say hot pot there. Hot pot is, again, it's a soup dish which we drop in some raw foods, and when they're cooked, you could take them out, dip it into a sauce. Now that soup can have many flavors. I particularly like the mushroom sort of flavors and the seafood ones. Although living in Chongqing, they just want spicy hot pot, which is not my favorite. I think from the China to the UK, WeChat and the availability of doing things online was very, very useful. WeChat is an app that everyone in China uses and has, and it's fantastic for sharing money, for buying travel, for basically anything that you need to do, you can do through the WeChat app. So you can send, it can include Venmo, so you could send money to your friends after having lunch together. You could pay through QR codes, you could pay for your bills. Right now, you can use WeChat to register with the local government when you arrive in China. It's brilliant. And in the UK, we do not have any app that is so useful. And I think the main way that's useful is that everyone has it. So no matter where you are, you can use it. Another thing I'd take from China to the UK, the train system. I would definitely take China's train system to the UK. The trains are always on time, you always have a chair, and they are super fast, and they are always clean. That would be the three things from China. So hot pot, WeChat, and the trains. From the UK to China, I would take from the UK queuing. That would be my first thing. I think in China, queuing is seen as optional in many ways. I think that would be one of the major things I would say. Bring high-speed trains to the UK. Someone's just said that there. Absolutely. Very often the queuing can be somewhat chaotic, which obviously coming from an English person, that's somewhat difficult. Bring it to the UK to China. So James, you said Marmite. I'm not 100% sure, but perhaps, yeah, I did take Marmite from the UK to China. I do enjoy my Marmite. I would say, I say that's such a difficult question. Things that I would take from the UK to China. So say some of the online learning as a teacher. One of the things that I really found is very useful is the online learning or online support for learning. I think that universities in China have not, over the past decade that I was there, have not really embraced online support for learning. So that would be something I'd bring there, whether it's as simple as a VLE or Moodle. And the other thing, good Lord, Yiming, that's a very difficult question. Third thing I would take from the UK to China, I would take I think it's an interesting one. I would take the footpaths, public footpaths. And I think when I was in China, it's very difficult. When you go out to the countryside, you would go to a scenic spot, which is usually developed. You would park and you would follow developed pathways. Whereas in the UK, something I really enjoy when I go out for a walk is the footpath system. So you can follow and go through the countryside wherever you like. And I think that's something that I would take to China. So thank you. That's a very difficult question. So the things I take from the UK to China: queuing, online learning, and footpaths, public footpaths. There we go. Thank you very much. That's a difficult question. So, excuse me, as we sort of come to the end of this Chinese Corner, thank you. As you mentioned, further out of the cities, how would you describe the standard of living? Thank you, David. That's a great question to finish off. There is a large difference of the standard of living between the cities and the countryside. From what we've seen, it's from my experience, and again based purely on my experience, China has been in the in the past couple of decades has very much seen most of the countryside people, young men especially from the countryside, move to the cities. There has been a large migration of countryside to city. Now, this has led to quite an imbalance in the living standard in cities and in the countryside. So whereas in the UK, when we go to the countryside is probably wealthier than the cities in many places, especially the more beautiful or scenic places. We see a lot of when people gain their wealth in the city, they would buy their second homes in the countryside. Of course, this leads to its own problems in the UK. But whereas in China, when you go out of the cities, when you start to see the smaller communities in the countryside, they are generally poorer. And I think that's an issue that China is going to really focus on in the coming years. I know that it's something that's already being looked at, and it's again, there is quite a wealth gap between the city and the countrysides, and I think that's also generally coming from the further east to the west as you get further away from the seaboard cities. So it's an interesting city. That's a very interesting, and it's a big question. There are issues caused by the migration from cities, from countryside to city, and there are quite a few charities that are set up to try to help this, and I know that there are quite a few local and main government initiatives to try to support and try to bring back some sort of parity, as I think that will be needed for China in the future. So that's a good question. Thank you. Susan, there we go. Thank you again. The standard of healthcare, if I needed it. It's an interesting one. It's different. This was an eye-opening time because China, obviously growing up in England with the NHS, you just go to the hospital. Obviously, in China you have to pay. So because it's paid, the healthcare was quite good. I was fortunate not to have any serious illness. However, however, going to the hospital was a very different experience. Of course, you would go in, you'd see a nurse, or you'd take your ticket, wait for a turn to be seen. Then you'd see the first person you would see would give a basic, give you a once over, say this is the next person to see, when you would then go and pay, which again, quite an unusual thing for someone growing up the NHS. Then after you've paid, you would then go to either the X-ray or the next person in that stage, and then from there they would say what you need to do. You go and pay, and then you go and get the medicine that you need. The standard of it was quite high. I mean, last time I was in China, I needed to see the dentist, and it was highly professional, totally clean, very modern. Again, that was in one of the larger cities, so a lot of the healthcare is very high standard. So again, that may well be the part where I go. It is also much more public, I think, is one of the ways forward. It's because of the numbers of people going. When we did have to go and see a doctor, it's not unusual to have other people in the office talking or trying to talk to the doctor at the same time in some places, which can be quite strange. I remember when trying to see a doctor for my child, and in the office there were quite a few children and families sort of in line around the desk waiting to talk to the doctor. However, again, the standard of healthcare was high. Did I try traditional Chinese medicine? Yes, I've tried acupuncture before. It worked for me. Chinese traditional medicine, I have used. I had a very close friend, an American friend, who was studying to become a traditional Chinese medicine doctor, and we had long discussions about traditional Chinese medicine. The herbal remedies I have tried, say they're horrible, I think, is the best way to describe them. Generally speaking, the smell is very much something to avoid. And the interesting thing, coming again with the back to the standard of healthcare and looking at the hospitals, every hospital in China has a traditional Chinese medicine section, so it's very much part of the mainstream of healthcare. I did also have some different massage and other things like this. So I've tried traditional Chinese medicine. It's something for, I think, for again, I'm not a professional in this area, but for smaller ongoing health issues, I think there is a lot to be said for their way of approaching a sort of a holistic health, so looking at the whole body and how the whole sort of almost looking at the lifestyle factors as well, rather than as much as simply focusing on the symptoms and alleviating them. So thank you, and I think there is a good place to try to wrap this up. I want to say thank you very much to everyone who's asked a question. I hope I've been able to answer them to your satisfaction. And next week we will be inviting a Tai Chi expert from I cannot remember exactly where she is, but she's based in China, and Lotus will be coming to explain the background to Tai Chi, why it's so popular, and what are some of the benefits. And I hope to see some of you then. Thank you all for your questions, and if you do have further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Coventry University Confucius Institute. Thank you very much, everyone. 谢谢大家, and speak soon. Bye bye.